Now let's talk about who's actually in charge of your life. Because it's not really you. It's the Tsar, sitting in a palace you'll never see, making decisions about taxes, military service, and law that trickle down through provincial governors, local nobility, and village elders until they land squarely on your shoulders. You have essentially zero say in any of it. There's no vote, there's no local council with real power. If a decision gets made in St. Petersburg, you simply live with the consequences. Religion, on the other hand, is not optional and not distant. The Russian Orthodox Church is woven into literally every part of your existence. You're baptized within days of being born. Your calendar revolves around saints' days and religious feasts. Church bells mark time in a world without clocks in every home. And the priest isn't just a spiritual figure, he's often the closest thing to an authority figure and record keeper your village has. Whatever comfort religion gives you, and it gives plenty, it's also doing quiet work to keep everyone accepting their lot in life as God's will. Let's fast forward to your childhood ending abruptly, because it does, around age 12 or 13, when you're basically considered a working adult. If you're a boy, you're doing full field labor alongside grown men. If you're a girl, you're doing that plus most of the domestic work, and you're also now old enough to start being evaluated as marriage material, because peasant marriages happen young, often before 20, arranged more around practical labor needs than anything resembling romance. Here's where your life takes its first real fork depending on your gender and your luck. If you're male, somewhere around age 20, you're eligible for conscription into the Imperial Russian Army. Military service at this point in history is a massive chunk of your life, historically 25 years, though reforms happening right around now are cutting that down to something closer to 6 years of active duty plus reserve time. Either way, if your number comes up, you might find yourself hauled off to fight in conflicts you have zero personal stake in, like the war against the Ottoman Empire that's about to kick off in 1877, fighting in the Balkans over territory and influence you couldn't point to on a map. If you're female, your options are narrower and mostly stay within the village. Marriage, children, endless domestic and agricultural labor, and if you're really unlucky, watching several of those children die young, because child mortality doesn't discriminate and grief is just a normal, expected part of adult life here. Women in this era don't own property independently, don't have legal standing separate from their husbands, and have essentially no path to education beyond basic religious instruction, if that. Let's talk about disease for a second, because it's going to be a recurring character in your life, whether you like it or not. Cholera outbreaks sweep through Russia periodically. Typhus loves overcrowded winter housing. Smallpox is still a serious threat, even though vaccination exists and is technically being pushed by the government, though it hasn't reached every remote village yet. Medical care, if you can call it that, mostly means home remedies, folk healers, and the occasional traveling doctor who might see your entire district once a year if you're lucky. Average life expectancy for someone born right now hovers somewhere in the low 30s, though that number is dragged down hard by infant and child mortality. If you survive childhood, your odds genuinely improve. Now, it's not entirely doom and gloom, because there are a few upsides worth mentioning. Village life comes with a strong communal safety net, at least by the standards of the time. Your neighbors help with harvests, weddings, funerals, and hard times, because everyone understands that today it's your family struggling, and tomorrow it could be theirs. Festivals and religious holidays punctuate the year with actual joy, music, dancing, and food, giving you something to look forward to between brutal harvest seasons. And despite having almost no formal education, oral tradition runs deep. Stories, songs, and practical knowledge get passed down constantly, and you'll grow up with a rich internal world of folklore even if you never learn to read a single word. Let's jump ahead now, because your life doesn't stay static, and neither does the empire around you. In 1881, when you're around 6 years old, Tsar Alexander II gets assassinated by revolutionaries, and his son cracks down hard, rolling back reforms and tightening control. You won't understand the politics of it as a child, but you'll feel the ripple effects for decades. More restrictions, more surveillance of anything resembling dissent, and a government growing increasingly paranoid about the exact kind of unrest that's quietly building in cities you've never visited. Congratulations! You've just been born into one of the worst possible timelines a human being could pick. The year is 1875. And here's the twist nobody told you before you signed up for this life. There is no Soviet Union yet. Not even close. You've actually been born into the Russian Empire, ruled by a guy named Tsar Alexander II, who technically freed the serfs 14 years ago, but forgot to mention that freedom would still feel exactly like slavery with extra paperwork. The Soviet Union you were promised? That's still 42 years away. You'll actually live to see it happen. Buckle up, because getting there is going to be one of the roughest rides in human history. Let's start with the basics. You're born in a one-room wooden hut, probably somewhere in the countryside, because 85% of the empire is peasants and you've just joined the club. There's no doctor in the room. There's a midwife, if you're lucky, and a lot of prayer, because roughly a quarter of babies born this year won't make it to their 5th birthday. Congratulations again, you beat the odds just by finishing this paragraph. Your first few months are simple. Eat, cry, sleep, repeat, in a hut that's shared with your parents, your siblings, and possibly a goat, because livestock sleeping indoors during winter is just good thermal engineering when it's -30 outside. Nobody's tracking your milestones in a baby book. Nobody's baby-proofing anything. The stove in the corner is both your main heat source and your biggest hazard, and you will absolutely be left near it unsupervised at some point because your mother has fields to work and 6 other things demanding her attention. By the time you're walking, you're already being handed small chores. Not because anyone's cruel, just because everyone in this house works, full stop, and that includes you. You'll be fetching water, feeding chickens, and watching younger siblings before you're old enough to read. Which, by the way, you probably never will be. Literacy in the Russian countryside right now sits somewhere around 20%, and it's even lower if you're a girl. School, if it exists in your village at all, might be a single room run by the local priest, and attendance is optional in the sense that your family desperately needs you working the fields more than they need you conjugating verbs. Speaking of the fields, this is basically your entire childhood. You're part of something called the Mir, a village commune that collectively owns and redistributes the farmland every so often, supposedly to keep things fair. In practice, it means nobody has much incentive to improve their patch of dirt, because next year it might not even be yours. You grow rye, wheat if the soil's generous, potatoes if it's not, and you pray for a good harvest because there is no such thing as a safety net here. A bad harvest doesn't mean tightening the belt. It means people in your village will starve, and in a few decades, this exact scenario will produce famines so severe that they become historical case studies. Your daily rhythm is dictated entirely by sunlight and season. Summer means back-breaking labor from before dawn until after dusk, scythe in hand, cutting grain by hand because mechanized farming hasn't reached your corner of the empire yet, and honestly, might not for another 50 years. Winter is the opposite extreme. Brutal cold, minimal daylight, and a lot of time crammed into that one-room hut doing indoor work like weaving or repairing tools, mostly just trying not to freeze or starve before spring. By the time you're in your 20s and 30s, industrialization is finally creeping into Russia, decades behind Western Europe. Railways expand, factories start appearing in cities, and here's an option that didn't exist for your parents. You could actually leave the village and go work in a factory in a growing city like Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's not glamorous. Factory conditions are brutal. Hours are long, pay is minimal, and housing is cramped and unsanitary. But it's also the first crack in a system that's kept people like you tied to the same patch of land for generations. Fast forward again, because now you're middle-aged, and the empire around you is coming apart at the seams. There's a war with Japan in 1904 that Russia loses badly, an embarrassment that shakes public confidence. There's a revolution attempt in 1905 that gets crushed, but forces the Tsar to grudgingly allow a parliament with basically no real power. And then, in 1914, the empire drags itself into the First World War. And if you're still physically able, you or your sons are getting pulled into a conflict that will kill and wound Russian soldiers by the millions and bleed the country's economy dry. And then, finally, in 1917, it happens. The event you were promised at the very start of this video. The monarchy collapses. Revolution sweeps through the empire. By the end of that chaotic year, the Bolsheviks seize power, and within a few more years of brutal civil war, the Soviet Union you were expecting from minute one finally comes into existence. You're in your mid-40s by now, having lived through famine, war, disease, and enormous social upheaval. And suddenly, the entire structure of the world you grew up in gets torn down and rebuilt from scratch, whether you wanted it rebuilt or not. So here's the honest tally. If you were born in the Russian Empire in 1875, you spent your childhood as unpaid agricultural labor, your adolescence getting married off or shipped into the army, your adulthood surviving disease, famine, and one catastrophic war after another. And you didn't actually live under the Soviet Union you were promised until you were already middle-aged, and only after watching the entire world you knew burn down around you first. Was it worth it? That's not really a question this era was built to answer. You didn't get asked whether you wanted to be born a peasant under a crumbling empire on the edge of revolution. Nobody does. You just show up and you deal with whatever decade you land in. In 1875 in Russia, that decade dealt you one of the hardest hands history has ever handed out.